Thank you, Rod. And after the introductions this morning, I'm feeling somewhat obliged to say I was born in 1968. It's great to be back at Laidlaw, and it's always good to come back to college. And perhaps with Rod's comments, I have this overwhelming urge to say Bible college, as it was when I was here. But I'm getting used to saying Laidlaw, and I must say, around town, it's always great to make connections because it doesn't take too long in conversation to find someone who's been influenced by this place and ministry. And I was a BD student here, 97 to 99, and had the chance to practice some leadership while I was here as well. A bit more about me, just briefly. I'm a Wellingtonian, a Hurricanes fan, and on a journey through the legal career that took me to London, came back to Auckland to study here. And I emailed Chris Marshall from London when I was thinking about the possibility of studying and said, tell me some good places to study in England. And he said, what about coming back to Auckland? So here we are. And thought, like everybody south of the Bombay Hills, this journey would be transitory to live in this city. But 15 years on, here we are still. And so Laidlaw, St John's College in Meadowbank, and then St Aidan's in Remuera for 10 and a half years, where I was the student, a deacon assistant, priest assistant, then the vicar. And in 2010, found my journey taking me to the cathedral, which is an exciting one, a challenging one. And it's the context really out of which I want to speak today, because I'm going to pick up very much on that denominational tag on my talk. I also want to acknowledge, as well as Rod did in a different way, that putting days aside like this in your diary is a big ask. I know they are precious hours. Life and ministry is busy, and the tyranny of the urgent is always pressing. And to put aside a Friday, when perhaps Sunday's sermon isn't yet written, is a great sacrifice. And so I want to honour that today, and also hope that from the totality of the day, there's something that helped you clear your mind a bit, that you had a moment not to worry about the phone. Perhaps a sermon starter was there somewhere, and it's been good for your soul as you drive home today. To begin, I suppose it is then helpful to frame how I want to talk for the next 45 or so minutes, and also to invite us to talk together. Leadership formation, as Rod has said, is a big topic. It's a lifetime journey, and it's a bestseller. When you go to the book depository, 500 million hits later, you can have any book on leadership. There's that urgency, and there has been throughout history, I think, to get to the right answer, the best recipe. So to provide some parameters for what I'm going to say then, in the advertising, in the blurb, it clearly had the word denominational underneath it. And so I want to tell you today about some of the questions I think we're facing as Anglicans in our diocese and in our province, and have several colleagues in the room who might want to correct me over lunchtime, but these are mine. And from those questions and challenges then, to think together about the conversation, and tell you a little bit about the conversations we're having and where that might take us. On the face of it, you might think what I raised doesn't seem to be a leadership topic as such, not something you might find in the list of 21 or 15 or 8 or however many. But in fact, I think they're all about leadership. For without well-formed, well-founded, well-nurtured leadership, we address them in a vacuum and we come unstuck, and perhaps we even go nowhere. Having said that, I'm not going to ignore the biblical in the title either, hopefully some reflections woven through. I'd like to make 4 broad comments this morning, and what I plan to do is raise each comment or question, offer some discussion about it, tell you a bit of my and our story, and then knowing that I'm the second speaker, that you probably feel the need more to fidget in this session, that not far off my children. Our concentration spans have been reined in as well. That there'll be a chance to have some 2-minute chats to our neighbours, because what I know about coming to days like this is that the conversation around the lunch table with the person over the coffee when I arrived or in the car park when I'm going can be as valuable, if not more so, as anything that was said from the front. So today I want to honour that it's all about all of us. And as I look around the room, seeing lots of faces I know and lots that I don't and look forward to saying hello to, I want to honour your leadership. And I come just as a conversation starter today. So briefly, who are we? For those who wonder what the Anglican Church is really like, and you read a bit about us and probably have some comments to make on us. In our diocese, which goes from Thames to Cape Reinga, we are part of this province of the Anglican Communion, which is Aotearoa, New Zealand and Polynesia. So we're not just this collection of islands, we're Tonga, Fiji and Samoa as well. So we represent nations, cultural diversity, people groups, generations. In this diocese, we have 2 bishops, the diocesan bishop, who is, if you like, the boss, and an assistant. We have full-time archdeacons, regional bosses. We have a diocesan council, which is like the deacons and elders of a Baptist church, or the governing body, the session of the whole diocese. We have synod, our AGM, and we have ministry units, as we call them, parishes, chaplaincies, which might be hospitals, schools, prisons, all of them having their own self-governance as well. So there's a centrality, a togetherness, and an independence. And it's in that context, which makes it seems all the more complex often, that we have these kind of conversations. So, to start off then, something that I think brings leadership to the table and challenges us is a question that we are facing as a diocese, as a church, and even as a province really, is where do we think God is calling us to be the church in our day, and how? Where do we think God is calling us to be the church, and how? We hold this tension and diversity amongst us that we have in our diocese large churches filled with young people, inner city ministry, students and all that kind of thing. We have suburban family churches. We have rural churches that are struggling to survive. We have urban churches that are struggling to survive. We have liberal Catholic, we have conservative evangelical, we have every flavour going. And in this context, still the same question in front of all of us. Where is God taking us as the church? Who does God want us to be? And what should we look like? How should we be doing it? What does that then have to say about the leadership question? I think it means that we have to speak fully and frankly. We have to have courage. We have to let those who seem to sit outside the box of traditional leadership have a voice and recognise them as exercising leadership. And I think in that we have to be prayer-filled and scripture-informed. And I don't think we have to fear it. I think we have to embrace it. We're in need of leaders who can hold the tradition and who can push at the edges, because we need our history. We need to know our story, and we need to have hearts and minds to dream a dream and to push on where God is leading us. Not in contempt of one another, seeing ourselves in opposition, but seeing ourselves on the same journey. In my journey, I grew up in the Hutt Valley. I went to Taita Central, Taita Intermediate, and Taita College. When I was 10, I started at Tighter Intermediate, and in my class was a boy called Justin Duckworth. Some of you might have read about him recently. He's the Bishop-elect of the Diocese of Wellington. For those not familiar with that story, perhaps if I remind you, he has dreadlocks and is not a great fan of shoes and has lived an alternative, almost monastic kind of ministry in recent years. He's been inner city dwelling, dealing at the margins, caring for the most needy in our communities. He and I journeyed together through intermediate. We were in the same class all the way through high school. We went to university together. We were deeply, deeply formed by our involvement in campus life. Those meetings together, Youth for Christ rallies in the town hall that pointed us toward Jesus. When we stand side by side, we look quite different. We have all those classic differences about us. And yet, I think this is an era, and I'm heartened by the Diocese of Wellington, who's had the courage, where tradition's screaming all around us, especially in the Anglican Church, to say this is the man who God is calling us to lead. Because it's about having those conversations together about how is God calling us to be the church in this era? Where is God calling us to be the church? And how do we do this? How are we led in this? The second thing I'd like to raise, which comes out of our journey as a diocese, and I think too as the Anglican Church worldwide, is how once again and in our day do we lead in the face of things that profoundly divide us. The issue I'd like to put out there then and speak to this around in our context is the issue of human sexuality. As a sideline, and recognising my age and born in 1968, and that while that's in the context old-ish, there's a whole generation that came before me that had other debates that appeared to profoundly divide. I find myself a little bit perplexed that when we talk about Jesus, we can kind of hang out together when we have different views. When it comes to talking about us, we threaten to walk away when our neighbour has a different view. Sideline and back to the topic. But I think in our context, in our news, Barack Obama and our Prime Minister John Key have brought this topic firmly back into the public arena, not only our church arena. In our diocese and in our communion, this is the city of pain. Other denominations have been and are in that city as well, profoundly and directly. And we are the people of God, reflecting views held with sincerity, based on our understanding of the Scriptures and our seeking to live the kingdom of God in our day. And yet it takes us to a place where some argue for significant change and others argue against it. So in our communities, in our Anglican diocese, we've been on a journey of conversation. For many, it's felt far too long. For others, it feels like it's going far too fast. And yet in that context, we're called to offer leadership. As I've reflected on this and thinking about what do you say about being a leader in the face of that, I'm reminded that in our cathedral community, 6 days out of every 7, we say one of the creeds of our faith. And while many have put them aside, deemed them historic, they remain alive and well in our context and in many of our Anglican churches and others every Sunday. I think what they have to say to us is twofold. a reminder that throughout history, the church has been divided on one thing or another. And they're a symbol to us that there's been conversation. Also, I think, they point us as leaders always to be looking to the God whom we serve and to Christ. So we know the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, they all have stories of controversy around them and stories of leadership that were at the heart of it. As we address those, then, we find ourselves asking, who do we need to be in the conversation as leaders? First, I think we need to be reminded that we're pastors. Because these topics, often the things that divide us, are fundamentally about the people with whom we're conversing. So as we seek to lead, we need to be a pastor. And inherent in that is we need to be listeners before we're speakers. I think we need to be discerners. We need to be deeply founded in our scriptures and in prayer. We need to be in community as leaders, not one man or one woman bands. And we need to be stayers. A profound moment in leadership for me was when some years ago I was at a conference where Margaret Sentamu was one of the keynote speakers. She was giving Bible studies in the book of Ephesians. Margaret is the wife of Archbishop John Sentamu, who's the Archbishop of York. And some of you might recognise his face, his Ugandan birth and his very political stance on the regime there. And some of you might have noticed that in his clerical collar, he doesn't wear the white insert. It's part of his statement of justice that until those unjust regimes are put aside, he sets that aside as something of a symbol of God's kingdom yet to come on earth for people in injustice. Margaret spoke on issues that divide us, and in particular reflecting on this issue of human sexuality. Her sermon in a sentence, her overriding message, the sentence to take home, the take-home pack was, to a room largely filled with bishops, stay at the table. Now, we know in leadership the right place is not always to stay at the table. But I think way more often than not, it is. But the pressure we can often feel as leaders is with the populist, with the loudest voice, with the corner we're backed into. I think in this conversation, in our context, the leadership message is about leaders who can help the conversation continue. And part of that is managing, I think, what happens in us when a key issue is raised. How do we tend to ourselves in order that we can lead others in the conversation? That is a place of pain. We have to acknowledge that. And it's one that is teetering on division. My prayer, my hope is that the leaders who are taking us on, and for me and for us all as those people, that we can reflect well, pray well, read the scriptures well, and love our neighbour well to lead in that. For our communities who don't get all the junk mail, read all what's hot off the Christian press, read what scholar or bishop or whatever is saying whatever, they don't have necessarily as much of the stuff as we have biblically or theologically, but they are biblically and theologically educated, living in it, doing their own work, and they have the newspaper, they have their neighbours, they have their own lives and their reality. So we lead into that as pastors, as listeners, as discerners, as prayers, as stayers, and inviting them to stay with us. There are lots of other things that divide us. Sometimes it's the colour of the curtains that go into the new church, moving the altar from one side, the pulpit from one side to the other. And history tells that those divisions have been as graphic and as gruesome as some we face now. But it calls us again to reflect on our leadership. In a 2-minute gap now then, I want to ask you less to talk about the topic I've raised, but how do you feel as a leader in the face of division? And how do you attend to those feelings when they arise? What do you do with that? Reflecting then on leadership in the face of division, the things that divide us, the things that we disagree about. Perhaps my encouragement in there, my defining sentence is that we attend to ourselves well in order that we can be stayers and encourage our communities to stay with us at the table around God's love, God's word, God's presence in our mix. It's a tough ask, but in community and in God all things are possible. The third thing I want to raise out of our context, out of our conversations as Anglicans in this part of the world, is with the leadership lens and through it, how do we find our voice in the face of a seemingly, at best, disinterested and at worst, sceptical society about the story we have to proclaim? I think that's a reasonably accurate reflection when we think about how the media often picks up on our stuff. How sometimes it can be hard to get a good news story into the local newspaper, but the minute there's a crisis at the ranch, we're on the front page. I'm sure people in any other profession, any other part of the planet at the moment would agree with us that bad news makes good news. But somewhere in the journey, and I don't know, a lunchtime conversation perhaps, the last 50 to 60 years in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we find ourselves feeling more and more sidelined as the norm, as we might have described it, of bums on seats in church on Sunday, the family pew, it's just what we do on Sundays as opposed to what we do on Wednesdays. All those things have shifted. And along with it, the pages of news seem to have disappeared. And I think history will reflect that we found ourselves believing it, believing somewhere in the mix that we are to be silenced, that we're to be sidelined. We've felt disencouraged by it, and we've kind of just settled into it somehow. Yes, and that is also to say the story is out there. You know, it's not far away, but there's a kind of heaviness, I think, that pervaded the back end of the last century at least, that we settled into the place where we feel the world put us. That's been a tough place for leaders, as with the 52 or 22 or even the 5,000, we seek to encourage leaders and our communities to have a voice. So where do we take that? How do we reflect on that as leaders here and now in our day? I think we need confidence. I think we need to believe in our story, in ourselves, and in God at work within us. I think we need to be marked by confidence in this next century. And as people often finding ourselves at the front of the pack. I think we need to find that confidence refreshed in ourselves and watered and grown and tended to so that we proclaim it. We need to live confidently in the gospel as leaders, to know it for ourselves in all its fullness, and therefore proclaim it. And what does that confidence come from? Comes from us having a good biblical understanding. And for me, as someone who hasn't been in full-time biblical and theological study now for over a decade, I'm reminded and challenged over and over again in the tyranny of the urgent that as a leader, I have got to be taken back to the Word. I've got to find myself taking more than sound bites from it, more than what this Sunday's sermon is about, and to picking up a book, if you still pick up books, picking up something electronic, if that's your thing, talking to my friends, wrestling about it. Because the risk for us, and that's why I celebrate days like today, is that we can just get on with the tyranny of the urgent. And our confidence is undermined when we're not drawn back and back and back and back, I think, to God's word in a way other than just our giving it out to someone else for what to do with it during the week. Our knowledge has got to keep growing and growing and growing. So that challenges us as leaders, I think, in our taking of sabbaticals, of study leave, of what we do with it, in our regular patterns of how we conduct our week, of taking the opportunities that we can to be taught afresh, to do our own work. Also, I think, alongside that then, as we think about this seeming inability to speak into the world, we have to have excellent engagement with what's going on in our communities. We need to know about the budget. We need to know what's coming out and the impact that it has. We need to inform and be informed. We need to engage with justice in our societies at every level. At a local level, we're doing it all the time, but we need those amongst us who speak out at the philosophical, the political, the economic level, both to equip us as leaders and to change our politicians, our corporate leaders, to have that voice. So as we sit here feeling exhausted with all that, like quite when in my week do I get to do all those things? I think the reminder in here is we need collegiality with others. We need to cooperate. Not only as Anglicans within our diocese, within the structures we've set up, but at excellent things like today, across the church. We need to know who each other is. We need to tap into each other's wisdom and each other's practice. I think this is a really big issue that we face about speaking out into our communities, having the ear of our leaders and having it in the media so that people read about us, our work, our story about Jesus Christ. It's a tough challenge. There's skepticism, there's disinterest, there's often challenge, and there's all the issues of being a bicultural and multicultural society that we have to hold sensitively as we take it. But I don't think it's an option. And today I want to encourage us to be confident in that. So, a 2-minute pause. Do you agree with me that sociological change in Aotearoa, New Zealand, has left us in this place and that we've dared to believe that it's true? And how do you think that impacts on your leadership as you seek to have a voice in this day? Perhaps to sum up that reflection, can I encourage you today to be confident in the good news, to be confident in the truth that defines us? At last, and not quite in conclusion, but last, the fourth thing I want to raise about an issue I think that we're talking about and that faces us as an Anglican diocese here in Auckland is, how do we tell the story of God to generations who haven't even been able to pick it up even in the ether? Where there is no foundational presumption, maybe they haven't even heard the name Jesus. For me, having had some experience as a school chaplain, even in one of our church schools, it was not an uncommon phenomenon. How do we tell the story, explain, introduce people to God from the very beginning? Where I think that is leading us is, and in my conversations in the community of which I am part, with my colleagues and others in ministry, is it's calling us afresh to a reflection on who we understand God to be, how we articulate our relationship with Jesus Christ, and who are we in God. Because if there's no foundation to rely on, it's taking us to a different place when we could rely on all that stuff that was in Bible in schools even, or in their Sunday school understanding, and that they might know, say there were 10 commandments or something like that. We've got to revisit our own words, our own understanding, and maybe even our own relationship. And I think that question before us speaks very significantly into the question of leadership. Because that, I think, is the place as leaders we've always got to find ourselves. That's got to be one of the 21, however many we sign up to, it's got to be one of our foundational things, dare I suggest it. That who am I and God and where are we is about what it is about. That is us in leadership. And we know that throughout history, people have been talking about what this leadership thing is. From first century Roman philosophers saying it's impossible to imagine anything which better becomes a ruler than mercy, to Napoleon saying a leader is a dealer in hope. Benjamin Disraeli, whose grave I stumbled across when in High Wycombe recently, a leader, I must follow the people, am I not their leader? And even Steve Jobs, innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower. Every era, every decade, every 5 minutes, someone in history reflecting on leadership. But what we know as the people of God, and I think if there's some synchronicity between us, Rod, today, it's about drawing us back to the Christ, because that is where we are defined. And I think that's the place, motivated out of a mission need and evangelism need, that our current context is calling us back to as a church. I was challenged and encouraged in this when a few years ago I was on a leadership course. It was a fantastic leadership course, I would have to say, and it was all about story. It was 30 participants journeying through 2 or 3 days a month together for 10 months. And throughout the course of the year, we heard the stories of 82 New Zealand leaders. And they came to address us about their context and their story through the lens of leadership. It's a secular course, if you like, and in the room, in the participants, were doctors, accountants, police, corporates, not-for-profit, and the church. In that journey, I came across somebody who I'd never met, Peter Kammick, who's on the faculty at Canterbury University and is a consultant in management and leadership. At that time, he'd written a book called The Spirit of Leadership, and it remains on my shelf, one of the books I often reach to for a story to encourage me. interestingly, in this book put out there into the New Zealand commercial market, it's about his journey of understanding and how to teach others in leadership. What he comes to is a reframing where he sees that in the pie charts that he used to put up on the screen for people that said skills and character and all those kind of things, and one segment of the chart was soul, he now sees that as framing the whole. And the pie chart he puts underneath any seeking of skills, of lists, of things to do, of successful strategies, that must be on top of soul. And this book tells a fascinating story, being a book you could find on the shelf at Dimmock's in the non-religious section, say, about that journey and listening and conversation with corporate and commercial leaders about their defining. And it was those groups that pushed him to that place where people were saying, it is something beyond me. They defined that very differently, but something beyond me that undergirds the heart of who I am and therefore the how-to. I think we're living in an era, and have been for a little while, where the secular world has caught on, in leadership speak, to the something beyond us. I think in Aotearoa New Zealand we can say we're beyond just however many successful tips of how to make the coffee, not to have vanilla wines, or all those things in our communities, the things that'll make it work. I think our society is considering the who are we and what's beyond us. We can participate in that conversation. That's our story, isn't it? We get that. We've been doing that forever. And we point to Jesus as the who are we. So in our context then, from this question of generations now who've got nothing of the story, I think we're being drawn back to say, how do we tell it? What do we think the story is? If we can't rely on anything, how do I articulate it? And that's brought into sharp relief, I think, for us as leaders. And when we get there and when we put that out in front of us, then it draws us in close, brings us to Christ. And it leaves us in that place where there is me, you, and Jesus. And we're reminded that that's the soul, that's the definition that undergirds, that informs, that defines the me and the story that I tell. So, what does that ask of me as a leader then? What does it ask of us? Tending to that is vital. Caring for ourselves and our own relationship with God has got to be up there. I hope it was number one in that book. He hasn't got a big following here, if that's any comfort to you. I hope it was number one. Caring for ourselves. Who is God? Who am I? And where are we? So at a practical level, if you haven't got a spiritual director, why not? If you haven't got someone with whom you're having that conversation regularly, why not? In a way that's not about leadership strategy or what's happening at the office, but about who am I, who is God, where are we going or not? Can I encourage you to get on with it? And alongside that, supervision. Who are you talking to about the issues that are raised? The person that can help you reflect on those things through the lens of Christ, through our scriptures and through good practice. And they're not separate things, I don't think. So, what are you doing about tending to that? So in conclusion then, drawing us to a close, in framing what I've had to say today, what I've tried to do is to say, I think our context always informs what we need of our leadership, because it's in the moment, it's what's being asked of us. And so in the 4 particular things that come out of my context, that are biographical, if you like, that about our story, my story, I think in that idea about what does God want the church to be, where is God leading us, I think courage is my abiding reflection. Courage to hear the voices on the margins and the ones at the centre, and to go to those places and try them and test them. In our Anglican liturgy, there is a blessing that says, "Be strong and of good courage. Hold fast that which is good. Love and serve the Lord with singleness of heart, rejoicing in the power of the Spirit." A good prayer to hold, I think. When we think about things that divide us, I think that is the tough place. But I think God asks us in leadership to be stayers and to call others to stay with us. And that means we need to be well tended to and be in community, because we can't do it alone. But to stay at the table, I think God is there with us. In the midst of that disinterested, sceptical society, I think we need confidence. And it's great to have people who I've seen since I arrived here today, like Mark Kewen, who are helping us as church leaders in this city to speak in to our community through the newspaper, getting us slots at the big festivals and all those kind of things. And together in our local communities as well, to have confidence in the good news that is our story. And in the challenges we face in mission as a diocese, how do we speak to generations who've never heard? I think the fundamental is to draw in and then we push out. To draw in and then we push out, because that's the place where we know our God and we know who we are and what we're on about. And that's what we invite others to do in our leadership. So context informs how we understand what we need in our day of our leaders. But it's the Christ who is our great leader and defines us and is the one to whom we look. I'd like to conclude by reading a verse that's one of my favourite verses in all of the scriptures and has been in the lectionary in these last days. Jesus said, "Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me." Amen.